They told Tanzanians to accept what was given. They were told to wait. But now the streets say otherwise. Smoke, sirens, and the sound of ordinary people refusing silence. What happens when a nation famed for safaris and sunsets is pushed to the brink by an election many call illegitimate? And when a rival model, one built on putting capital and decision-making inside communities, offers a very different promise? In the next minutes, you will hear how violent protests, an internet blackout, and questions about accountability in Tanzania collided with an economic experiment in West Africa that insists wealth created in a country should strengthen that country. The stakes are civil liberties, lives, and a very different idea of how nations build power. Tanzania's calm exterior has long masked a deeper political reality. Since independence, a single party has dominated the country's institutions. In recent years, that dominance hardened into a pattern of exclusion that many citizens say throttles democratic space. Opposition voices who challenged the system faced arrest, intimidation, and in some cases violence. One prominent figure, a longtime critic who survived a deadly attack years earlier, was charged with treason in April 2025 as the country moved toward national elections. That arrest and the long list of sideline challengers convinced many Tanzanians that the playing field had been closed well before ballots were cast. On October 29, 2025, votes were cast under that tense backdrop, and scenes on the streets quickly turned explosive. Demonstrations erupted in Dar es Salaam and other cities after polling, with protesters demanding basic fairness in a process many described as predetermined. Eyewitnesses reported security forces responding with overwhelming force, tear gas, live ammunition in some locations, and sudden chaotic scenes as civilians fled. Within days, the government had imposed stringent security measures and, alarmingly, large-scale digital outages. Internet services were disrupted nationwide on Election Day, cutting social media and messaging channels and leaving citizens largely unable to share real-time information about what was happening on the ground. The official results, announced shortly afterward, added to the alarm. Authorities declared the incumbent the victor by an extraordinarily wide margin, a figure many observers called implausible given the breadth of political restrictions in the run-up to voting. International media and human rights organizations pointed to large numbers of civilian deaths during the unrest, estimates that vary, but which prompted urgent concern from UN experts and other observers about excessive use of force and possible unlawful killings. Those reports fueled anger and deepened a sense among many Tanzanians that the state had chosen control over accountability. The post-election environment hardened quickly. A normally public inauguration was held away from crowds and behind a secure perimeter, a symbolic image that reinforced the perception of a government leaning on security institutions rather than on public legitimacy. Journalists and citizens found themselves navigating a new caution. Reporting or posting critical views online risked detention. Streets that once thrummed with commerce and conversation fell into an uneasy quiet. For many, the closure of civic space and communications was not simply an immediate security response, it felt like a structural decision to limit dissent. International reactions were mixed and, to numerous observers inside Tanzania, disappointingly measured. A number of countries and international bodies issued calls for investigation and restraint. Some expressed concern about human rights violations and the restrictions on information. But the diplomatic tone frequently remained cautious, focused on statements and advisories rather than the kind of, say, immediate, coercive measures that activists had hoped might pressure accountable investigations. For ordinary Tanzanians who had seen friends, family members, and neighbors injured or disappeared, diplomatic caution read like indifference. Amid this crisis narrative, another African story was unfolding, one that illustrates a deliberate alternative approach to national development. In a West African capital, authorities repurposed a substantial portion of external assistance into a domestic farm credit program designed to put financing directly into the hands of rural producers. Government announcements and local reporting described loans and infrastructure investments aimed at irrigation, storage, water access, and supply chains so that farmers could plant and sell with confidence, rather than remain at the mercy of seasonal rains and fragile markets. Implementation emphasized transparency and local accountability, with public reporting systems designed to build trust between citizens and state institutions. Local reporting highlighted high repayment rates and rapid uptake in many communities, outcomes the government framed as proof that when people are trusted with capital, they respond responsibly. Why does that contrast matter? Because it reveals two different uses of state power. In one case, power is concentrated to secure order and preserve political advantage. In the other, power is mobilized to expand economic agency and civic trust. The Burkina Faso-style approach, for example, deliberately shifts decision-making, jobs, and procurement into the country, headquarters, factories, and executive offices that physically reside in the nation, create local career ladders, spark supplier networks, and force corporate leaders to be accountable where their profit is produced. Tonal differences aside, the effect is structural. When high-level decisions are local, policy incentives shift toward long-term community welfare instead of short-term extraction. Reporting on these programs emphasized the practical chain reaction. Construction creates jobs, procurement fuels small businesses, and visible investment strengthens public faith that national resources might serve citizens rather than vanish offshore. Those results speak directly to Traoré's broader argument about economic sovereignty. The model promoted from Ouagadougou, insisting that wealth generated at home should anchor development at home, reframes sovereignty as everyday economics rather than as ceremonial rhetoric. It rejects the notion that foreign profit and local poverty are an acceptable byproduct of growth. Instead, it demands that prosperity be rooted where labor, land, and enterprise actually exist. That reframing carries both symbolic and measurable consequences: rising local employment, deeper supply chains, more robust tax bases, and an increased ability for governments to monitor and regulate corporate practices. When companies base regional leadership inside the countries where they operate, executives are literally confronted by the living consequences of their strategy. Decision-making becomes visible and, therefore, more accountable. Contrast that with the dynamics in Tanzania, where civic space narrows and communication channels are severed, accountability retreats. When citizens cannot freely report abuses, and when opposition voices are sidelined, the social compact frays. Security responses that rely on force and information control can stabilize an incumbent's hold in the short term, but they risk eroding legitimacy and pushing grievances underground, where they fester and occasionally explode in violence. In such an environment, economic development is also harder to sustain. Investors seek predictability, and social instability raises costs and drives away long-term capital. The political and the economic are not separate stories. They are two parts of the same national trajectory. What does this mean for citizens, leaders, and the international community? First, it is a reminder that security and development policies must be judged by their effects on people's daily lives. Policies that strengthen local agency, whether through credible financing for farmers, requirements that decision centers operate locally, or transparent governance that channels tax revenue into services, can build resilience and public trust. Second, it underscores the limits of purely diplomatic expressions of concern when lives and rights are at stake. Measured statements are rarely a substitute for mechanisms that deter abuses and support independent investigations. Third, it shows that models of nation-building that prioritize economic inclusion and local accountability can provide a peaceful alternative to coercion, provided they are implemented transparently and with strong institutions to prevent capture. There are no simple fixes. Transitioning from extractive arrangements to locally grounded economic systems takes institutional capacity, anti-corruption safeguards, and credible enforcement. Likewise, restoring civic trust after violent repression requires transparent investigations, accountability for abuses, and meaningful reforms to ensure political competition is real and safe. But the comparison is instructive. One path deepens grievance and closure. The other invests in agency and the seeds of stability. If Tanzania's recent months teach a cautionary lesson about the dangers of closing civic space, the economic experiment in Burkina Faso offers a hopeful illustration that policy can be used to enlarge opportunity rather than shrink it. Which model will nations choose when the world watches? A politics of control or a politics of investment and inclusion? The answer will shape not only elections and business deals, but the day-to-day futures of millions of Africans.